Good evening and welcome to the Lower Paxton Township Historical Commission meeting. My name is Bob Thomas, and as a member of the commission, I'd like to welcome you to our first presentation for 2021. We want to continue to bring the untold local history to our residents, and actually tonight, in recognition that February is Black History Month, we have chosen tonight's topic to be related to local Black history. What we are presenting tonight is who we believe, we don't have it totally etched in granite, but who we believe were the first African American farm owners in Lower Paxton Township, Forrest and Fannie Foote. All right, let me give you a little introduction. As I mentioned, we believe the Footes to be of historical significance because we believe, based on the research we've been able to do, that they are the first African American farm owners in the township. We can't say that concretely, but based on what we know today, this is what we believe. The scope of this project started simply with the farm. Little did we know that the farm would be a gateway to a tremendous family history story. And that's what we hope to present tonight. Just to try to keep your interest, we're going to trace the Foote family ancestry back to the 1700s, colonial Virginia, and of course that involves the days of slavery. You're going to learn about a Foote ancestor that helped the Union Army during the Civil War. You're going to hear how the Foote family homestead made national news. As we researched this, we actually found a connection locally to the African American Masonic home and orphanage that was in Linglestown that was dedicated in 1909. And lastly, the Foote farm, as we will call it tonight, still exists, and we will visit it. The first hurdle was we weren't totally sure how to pronounce the family name. We see it recorded as Foote in some research documents. Speaking to some local Linglestown residents that actually knew Forrest and Fannie, they referred to him as Foote. Now, being a lifelong Linglestown resident, I know nobody in our town goes by their given name. So this may be the Linglestown nickname, perhaps. But locally, he was known as Foote. And I also want to take this time to introduce Ms. Irma King. Through the miracle of Ancestry.com, Dave Doyle was able to hook up with Irma. She's in California. She is a Foote family ancestor, and she was able to provide us with a tremendous amount of family historical information. So, Irma, if you're seeing this, thank you very much. Let me start with the family ancestry. As I mentioned, we're going back to the area around Fairfax, Virginia, outside of Alexandria, Northern Virginia. The story begins on a plantation owned by the Fitzhugh family, huge plantation that was called Ravensworth. Forrest Foote, who was our neighbor, his father, Frederick Forrest Foote Sr., was born into slavery around 1800 on the Fitzhugh plantation. Forrest Foote's grandmother and Frederick's mother was Rachel Cole Foote. And those dates are correct, 1748 to 1873. According to family records, she lived to be 125 years old. Okay? Keep that in mind as we go through this. Rachel was of mixed races. There was African American, there's white, there's Native American. Frederick Forrest Foote Sr. was born in 1800 According to Irma, we believe his father is William Rowe Foote, and this is where we think the Foote name begins in the family. This was something Irma provided. It was a Fitzhugh slave list from the 1850s. And on this list, you will see Frederick's brother, Bill Foote, and you will see Frederick's mother, Rachel. And you can see she's shown as 90 years old on this list. And at this point in time, Frederick was on another plantation. He was not on a Fitzhugh plantation. So Forrest's father, Frederick Forrest Foote Sr., as I mentioned, born 1800, died in 1895, so he himself lived to be 95 years of age. In 1864, he purchases a 33-acre farm for $500 in the area of Seven Corners, Virginia. Keep in mind, in 1864, the Civil War is still going on. According to our research, he earned his money by working on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, selling wood, and he also served as a Union Army blacksmith and guide at the first battle of Bull Run. Let's just think a little bit about what's on this slide. We have an ex-slave purchasing a farm during the Civil War in a Confederate state. He also is helping the Union troops during the Civil War. So this just seemed to be part of the amazing story that Irma showed us. Forrest Foote's mother's name was Margaret Victoria Foote. We've not had as much luck researching her family ancestry, although we do have some indication she may also have been of Native American race at some point. What I want to point out is that Margaret is actually Frederick Sr.'s second wife. And to the second wife, he has a daughter, Virginia, a son, Franklin, and our neighbor, Forrest, is born around 1878, but I will tell you the census records bob around a little bit. Officially on his death certificate, Forrest is shown as born as 1875, but the census records vary. The 1880 census has him being born around 1878. This is Forrest's half-brother. This is Fred Foote Jr. Now, Fred was from Fred Sr.'s first wife, and as the article indicates, he was the town's leading grocer and served as Falls Church's first Negro councilman. So they're prosperous folks, they're merchants, they're running a business, and they're also involved in the community as a councilman. This is another picture. The picture is supposedly of Fred Foote Jr., but it also lays out the history of purchasing a farm and eventually selling it. I mentioned Forrest's grandmother, Rachel Cole Foote. This was a newspaper article from 1873 announcing that there was living in their village of Falls Church a woman named Rachel Foote, who was said to be 125 years old. So that matches up to some other records we have found. This was interesting. There was actually a Senate of the United States bill, a bill in our U.S. Senate, specifically to reimburse Frederick Foote Sr. for the amount of $1,095 for reimbursement of supplies that were taken from him during the Civil War. It's interesting that this bill is 20 years after the end of the Civil War, but it's I'm not sure many people have had a U.S. Senate bill specifically for them. Through Irma, we were able to get Fred Sr.'s will of 1880. And very quickly, I can go through this. He names his wife, Margaret, to inherit all of his properties, and upon her death, it's to be divided equally among the children, Virginia, Frank, and Forrest. This is interesting. The object of this will being to keep the said property forever in the Foote family and prevent any or all of the heirs or descendants of the said Frederick Foote Sr. from ever selling or disposing of said realty. And I was running this past a friend of mine, and I think you have to look at this in the perspective of 1880. 15 years roughly after the Civil War is over, an ex-slave, the ownership of land meant stability for a family. And I have a feeling what Frederick Sr. was doing here was trying to assure stability for his family forever, that this farm was never to be sold. Now it gets a little interesting, where he also denotes in his will that the children to my first wife and one daughter to the second wife are to receive the sum of $1 each. Clearly, that was his desire. Keep that in mind. We'll touch on that in a little bit. He makes his wife Margaret his sole executor, and this will is executed in 1880. He does not pass away until 1895. So with that backdrop, the family homestead stays in the family. But forward into the 1950s, and all of a sudden, this farm is surrounded by developed residential and commercial areas outside Alexandria, Virginia. In 1952, Forrest's sister and brother had to go to court to get permission to overturn their father's will to sell the property. The situation had become that the land had become assessed at such a high value that they could not afford the taxes on the land, because this was suburban Alexandria, Virginia. So the court did allow them to sell the farm. So in 1953, what I call the original part of the farm was sold for $750,000, which would roughly equate to about $6 million in today's money. Our neighbor Forrest, however, had signed over his interest in this land to his sister Margaret prior to that. So it appears, from what we can tell, that Forrest did not share in this inheritance. However, there were other parcels of this land that were not included in this sale. Those came up for sale in 1958 and sold for $2 million. This was a picture that Irma provided of and as it's titled, The Ex-Slave's Homestead. And it's an old log cabin, basically the original Frederick Foote homestead. This was an article from 1953 describing the sale, and the $750,000 was split between Forrest's sister Margaret and his brother Frank. This was interesting, and another article describing the sale, and here what's interesting that one son, Joseph, who had been missing since 1912 and declared legally dead in 1938, surfaces when the news hits about the sale of this land. And then at the very bottom it describes our neighbor Forrest, another child living of the blacksmith, Forrest Foote, a farmer in Linglestown, PA, deeded his interest to Mrs. Margaret Foote Jackson, his sister. And then the courts evidently it appears took the $750,000 and said we're going to pay it out in $16,000 increments, which in the 1950s was still a lot of money. In 1958, the $2 million land sale actually made the cover of Ebony magazine. Virginia heirs net $2 million in land deals. So this actually made national news. There's an article and a picture, and this gentleman pictured here is Fred Foote III, which would have been Forrest's nephew. But the article lays out how the family homestead how they had to get an adjudication to get the will overturned to be able to sell this property. So now let's start to talk about our neighbor Forrest Foote. There's a few census entries that we've been able to identify. In 1910, he shows up in Cornwall, Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. In 1920 census, he's operating a blacksmith shop in Halifax, which is just up the river from us. In 1930, Fannie and Forrest are at the African American Masonic home in Linglestown. And on that census, it shows they had 6 male boarders, ages 53 to 82. The 1940 census, we now find the Foote family on their farm in Linglestown. So just to tell you a little bit about Forrest, as I mentioned, he's born June 11th, 1875. In Falls Church, Virginia. He died in 1966 at the age of 90. Has a son, Frank, and a daughter, Margaret. His wife, Fannie, died in 1952. In 1932, as I mentioned, they purchased the farm north of Linglestown, and he operates a small dairy farm. In 1968, roughly 2 years after his death, the estate is settled and the farm is sold. Probably the most frustrating part about this project is we've not been able to find a picture of Forrest and Fannie Foote. We have, however, found pictures of their children. On the left is Margaret Foote, his daughter. On the right is Frank Foote. And what's interesting, both are graduates of the old Lower Paxton High School. And once we figured this out, we realized we had these pictures in our collection out here in the showcase of the old Lower Paxton High School yearbooks. So they're both graduates of the old LP High School. I mentioned the Masonic home for the aged. And our commission actually on our Facebook page, you can find our presentation of a year or two ago. We did a presentation on this home and orphanage. But I just wanted to show you, it's located right off Parkway East and Linglestown Road, about a mile east of the center of Linglestown. It's still undeveloped land. I pulled a few pictures from our prior presentation. It was dedicated in 1909. And what this was, the African American Masonic Lodges of Pennsylvania banded together to purchase a farm and operate it as a home for the aged, for aged Masons. The only picture we have of the building, of the house, is this one, so it's not very clear, but it sits right beside St. Thomas Church. I did try to blow it up, but I'm not sure that gave us anything better. Of course, this property, the house has all been demolished decades ago, but the farm property is still undeveloped and still owned by the Masonic Lodge of Pennsylvania. And actually, this was a death certificate that we found for one of the residents at the home in 1938, and it's actually signed off by Mrs. Foote. So it appears in the 30s, they're both operating the home and they also own their farm at the same time. So let's talk about the Foote farm in Linglestown. 51 acres. Today, where the barn and the house are has been whittled down to about 4 acres. The rest of the land's been subdivided and built on and sold off. So, but the original farm was 51 acres. It's not far at all from the Masonic home. It's also on Parkway East. The farm itself is very old, dates to the 1700s. The farmhouse, we believe, dates to about 1851. And as I mentioned earlier, the Footes operate a small dairy farm. The farm is located off of Parkway East, on the west side of Parkway East, right near the foot of the mountain, just north of Linglestown. In doing some research, it appears the original land grant for this property was issued in 1765 to a William Calley. We estimate that original land grant to be something like that. It may not be exact, but roughly. And you can see the Foote farm was about a third of the original land grant. This is showing the actual farm. This is what we think constituted the 51 acres. At least those lots add up to 51 acres. But it's roughly that, and the house and barn are down there right along the road. It's interesting, on the very northern property line, right up where the mountain starts, we actually found the original locust tree fence posts and barbed wire. They don't jump out at you because, as you can tell, the trees have filled in and they blend in pretty well. But the northern property line fence posts are still actually there. This is the farmhouse, as I mentioned, built in 1851. And for a, 170-year-old house, it's in very good condition. The farm, the property's in great condition for its age. This is a front view of the house. And just wanted to note that the basement level is actually a walkout basement there in the front. And that's because in the basement there are 2 cooking areas. There's a large Dutch oven on one end of the basement. There's a large fireplace on the other end of the basement. And there's a ghost down there. I mean, seriously, when we were here, the ghost wasn't in the basement, it was upstairs. Yes, we were informed that the house does have a resident from another dimension, a friendly ghost, but a noisy ghost. They tend to slam a lot of kitchen cupboards and drawers. But yeah, we're told there is a spirit in the house. This was interesting, and for you Oak Island fans, this is some woodwork that was at one point part of an exterior wall. And the house is built, with old construction, dowels. But what's interesting is the 2 members that make this joint are marked in Roman numerals. As far as the dairy farm, believe it or not, we were able to find a gentleman who actually hauled the milk from the farm. And actually talked to another gentleman who even went further back, and he can remember Forrest Foote hauling his milk on his horse-drawn wagon out Blue Mountain Parkway into Linglestown, about a mile, where it would be picked up to be taken to a dairy. Later on, when vehicles arrived, they started to pick up Forrest's milk directly from the farm. And I was told that he produced 2 of those metal cans a day. So the thing is, dairy farming is not a 5-day-a-week job. It's a 7-day-a-week, 52-week, 365. It's a daily job. And what we were told was they would pick up Forrest's milk first because he did not have refrigeration. So his milk was coming fresh from the cow into the can and being picked up. It's interesting, his milk was hauled down to the Hershey chocolate factory about 10, 15 miles down the road. So his milk was actually used in making Hershey's candy. And Harold Chubb, who gave me this, he said Forrest was a real nice, pleasant guy, was how he described Forrest. The barn on the property, also in excellent condition, given how old it is. Typical Pennsylvania bank barn, metal roof. The lower levels where the livestock was kept. The inside of the barn, it's interesting. From the outside, it looks like the walls are solid, but when you get in an old barn and the sun's shining in, you see how many gaps there are in the wall. But it's just classic Pennsylvania bank barn construction, huge timbers, hand-worked timbers, and as the current owner told us, there's not a nail or a metal spike in the barn. This barn is completely made by wooden dowel, held together by dowels. But you can see the work marks of working the wood, and these are huge, huge wooden beams in this barn. This is some of the barn wood that created the upper loft for the hay storage. What's interesting is, and these are just huge straight trees, but you can actually see the bark is still on the side of some of this timber. Just amazing to see old history. This is the lower level where the livestock would have been kept, and probably one of the stalls that Forrest probably kept his dairy cattle in. Not much has changed with the barn. And this is a picture of in the lower level, the very northern wall of the barn. It interests us because it was actually built on a slant, which is probably to hold the land in because this would have been the side you would be driving up into the barn. But the timbers in this lower level are huge. I mean, humongous wooden timbers, which I guess for a barn you would expect. We identified that Forrest and Fannie are both buried in a historic cemetery in Steelton, Pennsylvania, which is in the area here. The Midland Cemetery in Steelton dates to 1795. And as its website indicates, it is the final resting place for slaves, former slaves, men of the United States colored troops, Buffalo soldiers, and numerous leaders of the area's African American community. So their final resting place is actually a historic cemetery. A personal perspective, Irma King is authoring for us her thoughts on what her family history means to her. Because it was, this is a personal family story, and it's something to be proud of. And I just need to thank a number of people, Jack and Teresa Gardner for allowing us access to the property, Irma King, who I mentioned was just a gold mine with, historical ancestry information. Pat and Bill Mitchell also granted us access to their property. Denise Daimler on our commission did all the property research. Dave Doyle, like I said, through Ancestry.com, found a tremendous amount of information for us. The next two guys are actually two local individuals that knew Foote, as they call him. And John Kepler was a neighbor, and he shared some of his personal stories. And Harold Chubb was the milk hauler. So, both speak very highly of the Foote family. And of course, to make this all presentable for everyone, I have to thank Pat Navigato, our video guy. So with that is the story of the Forrest and Fannie Foote farm. Thank you.